We have a RB3 is the guy who maybe his name's been mentioned more on this podcast than any other. I think I've heard that some people have turned it into a drinking game whenever I say Blake Corum and Chargers. He is the running back out of Michigan who was a complete workhorse for Jim Harbaugh, but also shared. They just ran the ball enough that you can have both of those. His production was really front loaded, which I think is interesting. Maybe not production, but efficiency. I think is interesting in terms of we like young production, but we don't really like it when the last thing we saw wasn't as good. So how do you kind of mesh those two things with Blake Corum?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that you can subjectively look at him and say, okay, he was coming off the injury, and there's reason that he maybe lacked some burst and such this past season. But look, I think even despite all that, he's a very good, very consistent back. You kind of know what you're getting from him. He had really solid above average marks sort of across the class, right? He had the 9th best breakout score in the class. His best season reception share was 12th best. If there's one negative or red flag to his profile, you could say size for sure. I'll get to that in a second, but also his age, right? He's well over 23 years old, and age is a factor that we have to not only consider in terms of how these guys produce and what kind of talent they hold, because younger players producing early shows us that they're talented. I use the example in my prospect guide where if an 11-year-old is playing the piano in this crazy, crazy song on the piano versus a 19-year-old playing that song, chances are, when they're 25 years old, the 11-year-old is going to be way better at playing piano than the 19-year-old will be, right? And so, we're seeing that with Corum to some degree, but he was able to at least produce at a fairly young age, just that he's coming out a little bit older. And then when it comes to size, and I think that this is really interesting to sort of like paint this picture of Blake Corum being like a solid potential RB2 in fantasy. I don't think that he has necessarily RB1 upside, but to be a consistent, solid enough, throw him in your lineup, get 12 to 14 PPR points and feel okay about it. I think that this is probably the thing that tells it best. So I do think size is somewhat of a concern. He's sub 5'9". Since 2011, we've only had 6 running backs get drafted in the top 100 who were under 5'9". And again, height is not part of my model, but weight is. He's at least a little bit more compact. He has a decent BMI. But even still, let's just run with this for a little bit. Only one of those running backs scored more than 15 PPR points per game in one of his first 3 seasons in the league. So 1 of 6 gave you like a, low end RB1 season once throughout that time frame. But 5 of those 6 smaller backs, shorter backs, hit 12 or more PPR points per game in one of their first 3 years in the league. And I think that's the perfect example of what Blake Corum is that if you get a smaller running back that's going to get drafted, and I say smaller as in just like stature and height. If you get a smaller running back getting drafted, on day 2 in the top 100, there's likely some talent there. They're likely going to give him some sort of workload. It's just that I don't know if the ceiling would necessarily be there, right? And that's exactly what his profile screams throughout. I think he's arguably the safest running back in this class, right? Like if you want to get RB2 production, in a tandem more than likely and at the NFL level, who then, if his tandem partner gets hurt, he can probably shoulder the workload, for a game or two or a stretch of games. So that's great. But I don't know if he's ever going to be like a true bell cow back in the NFL.
When you talk about Blake Corum in a tandem, does he end up in a tandem that's one of those ambiguous tandems where it's 2 series for one guy, 1 series for the next? Is it a tandem because he's coming off the field on passing downs and third downs? It's a tandem because he's coming off the field in short yardage and in the red zone.
Yeah, I think it's a series thing. Like he actually was pretty good at the goal line and such. I don't know if an NFL team, because like Darren Sproles was decent at at doing that kind of thing. I just don't know if like an NFL team is going to really do that. So I do think there is some fear of him not having the touchdown equity that we would want. But I do think it's more of a rotation, by drive or something, or even him, between the 20s, seeing 65% of the team's backfield share. But then once you get into the red zone, you switch things out a little bit. I don't think that he's not a bad pass catcher. I just don't think that he's, someone that you're going to need to have on the field during those passing down situations. But look, if he goes, let's just say he goes to the Chargers, right? And he's paired up with Gus Edwards, which I think could work because, I think he's capable enough as a receiver. You're not going to get this like dynamic receiving out of the backfield with Blake Corum, but you're going to get solid enough receiving, better than Gus Edwards, right?
Right.
And so in that kind of situation, I could see the rotation happening, him maybe getting a little bit more work in between the 20s, and then Gus Edwards coming in and stealing all the touchdowns.
And like when you compare, because he's the kind of guy, it seems like to me, and I don't know if you've watched enough of the two to say, but he's probably more likely to be consistent on a play-to-play basis than Trey Benson.
Yes.
Yes. And so his fresh legs over someone like Gus Edwards, you could see in the second half of the season, they trust him enough to where he really is the 1A as opposed to Edwards starting the year as the 1A. Let's finish with his upside. You already kind of said you don't see that as probably an RB1 type situation unless he just happens to have a really good touchdown year. It sounds like the type of player that probably not great enough at anything to like guarantee he's going to do all of that work for the team, but not bad at anything that he has to come off the field in any certain situation. Is it like a David Montgomery type situation in terms of a potential fantasy upside? Could we see like somewhere in that RB15 range?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of him being in that range, yes. My fear, though, a guy like Montgomery always has the touchdown appeal, and he's at least shown us that he had the 3-down capability, and he had a more well-rounded production profile coming out as a prospect. I know that you're not making that comp per se, but like the comps, just to give you an idea, the statistical comps that were spit out for Blake Corum, and I know this is going to make people not excited about him, but it's Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Darrell Henderson, and Kendall Hunter, right? Where, I think that a guy like Henderson at his peak, if you will, was still able to give you decent fantasy production in the right spot. He just tailed off like most running backs generally do. I wouldn't be shocked if Blake Corum is only in the league for 4 or 5 years because that's just what happens at the running back position. But, all those guys were capable 3-down backs, but they didn't do any one thing super, super special. And that sometimes can limit a guy's ability to find the field. And that's my fear a little bit with Corum. But I do think overall he's solid. And if he gets top 100 draft capital, he's probably going to have an RB2 season or at least a high-end RB3 season across his first 3 years in the league.